Before chains, before auctions, before markets for human labor, one of history's earliest scams was already in place. It was called debt. Not debt as inconvenience, not debt as temporary hardship, but debt as a system designed without an exit. In the earliest civilizations, owing money was not a problem you solved, it was a condition you entered. And once inside, the law did not ask how you escaped, it only asked how long you would remain bound by it. This is where the scam begins. Early societies treated debt as a moral obligation. To owe was to fail was to lose status, and to lose status meant the law no longer protected you in the same way. At first, debt penalties were limited. Property could be seized, reputation could be damaged. But as economies expanded, debt quietly changed function. It stopped being a temporary imbalance and became a permanent relationship. If you could not repay what you owed, you did not disappear, you were absorbed. Your labor became collateral, your time became interest, and eventually your body became the guarantee. This was not accidental, it was structured. Legal codes from Mesopotamia, the ancient Near East, Greece, and Rome all reveal the same pattern emerging independently. Debt was transformed from a financial obligation into a tool of control, enforced by law and normalized by custom. Once debt became inheritable, once it could pass from parent to child, it ceased to be a transaction, it became a status. A person in debt was no longer someone who owed something, they were someone who belonged to someone. What makes this system deceptive is not violence, it is legitimacy. Contracts were witnessed, courts enforced them, officials recorded them. Everyone involved believed the process was lawful, necessary, and fair. There was no visible fraud, no broken rule, no obvious crime. That is what made it a scam. Because when obligation has no endpoint, freedom quietly disappears with it. Debt slavery did not arrive with chains, it arrived with paperwork. And once the law accepted debt as justification for ownership, slavery no longer needed force, it only needed consent, signed under pressure, and forced forever. This is where the system begins. Debt did not become permanent on its own. It required law to complete the transformation. Once early societies formalized debt, obligations stopped being personal and became legal. What had once been a private failure was now a public condition, recognized, recorded, and enforced by authority. This shift mattered, because when debt entered the legal system, it gained a new power. It could now be transferred, inherited, and enforced beyond the original agreement. Ancient legal codes reveal this transition clearly. In Mesopotamia, written law specified what happened when debts went unpaid. In Greece and Rome, statutes defined the rights of creditors and the limits placed on debtors. These were not vague customs, they were precise instructions. The law no longer asked whether repayment was possible, it asked who would be responsible when it failed. Under these systems, debt was not just an amount owed, it was a claim, a legal relationship that allowed one person to exercise authority over another for as long as the obligation remained unresolved. And unresolved obligations became common. Once courts recognized debt as enforceable beyond property, enforcement moved to people. If assets were insufficient, labor filled the gap. If labor failed, time replaced payment. And when time ran out, control followed. What made this transformation stable was consistency. The same rules applied repeatedly. Judges enforced contracts without questioning their consequences. Officials recorded outcomes without moral review. The system did not need to be cruel to be effective. It only needed to be predictable. Over time, debt enforcement stopped looking like punishment and started looking like order. Debtors were classified, terms were standardized, obligations were tracked.
What emerged was not chaos, but administration. This is where ownership quietly entered the equation. A person bound by debt was no longer simply obligated, they were constrained by law in ways that resembled possession. Their movement, labor, and future choices were limited by agreements they could no longer escape. Not through violence, through procedure. This legal framing normalized control. It removed the appearance of coercion and replaced it with process. Everyone involved could point to rules, records, and authority. And once obligation became enforceable as ownership, the boundary between debt and slavery began to dissolve. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but legally. Debt became permanent not only because it was enforced, but because it was designed to grow. Interest transformed obligation from a fixed amount into a moving target. What began as compensation for delay slowly became a mechanism that ensured repayment would never be enough. In early economies, interest was justified as balance. If money was lent, something extra was owed for the time it was absent. This logic appeared reasonable, it was measurable, it was contractual, and it was enforceable. But its effect was structural. Once interest was applied, debt no longer declined in a straight line. It expanded. Even when payments were made, the total obligation often remained unchanged. In some cases, it increased. For debtors living at subsistence level, this mattered more than any legal rule. A single bad season, a failed harvest, or an illness could interrupt repayment. Interest ensured that interruption became permanent. What made interest powerful was not its rate, but its persistence. Ancient records show compounding obligations across Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. Small loans accumulated penalties, penalties accumulated time, time accumulated control. The system did not require deception, it required mathematics. Interest converted uncertainty into inevitability. It absorbed risk from creditors and transferred it entirely to debtors. If conditions improved, repayment continued. If conditions worsened, obligation deepened. There was no scenario in which time alone solved the problem. This is where debt stopped responding to effort. Labor could reduce principal, but interest reasserted itself. Payment delayed the outcome without changing it. The debtor remained bound, not because they refused to work, but because the system required them to fall behind. What followed was predictable. When repayment failed, interest justified extension. When extension failed, labor replaced money. When labor failed, dependency replaced freedom. Interest did not enslave by force, it enslaved by arithmetic. And because the numbers were written, witnessed, and enforced, the system appeared neutral. No one needed to decide who would be trapped. The formula handled it. This is why debt systems survived moral criticism. They did not rely on cruelty, they relied on balance sheets. Once obligation could grow faster than repayment, escape became theoretical. And when escape becomes theoretical, control becomes permanent.
As debt systems expanded, contracts became the tool that stabilized them. Early agreements were simple: a loan, a deadline, a witness. But as obligation hardened into control, contracts evolved. They stopped describing temporary exchange and began defining permanent consequence. What mattered was not complexity, it was asymmetry. Ancient contracts were written to protect creditors, not to preserve balance. Terms were precise about repayment and vague about relief. Penalties were detailed, exits were not. This was deliberate. Contracts did not need to anticipate fairness, they needed to ensure compliance. Once signed, obligation became fixed in writing, even if conditions changed outside the document. Drought did not amend terms. Illness did not pause them. War did not dissolve them. The contract remained intact while reality shifted around it. This rigidity created reliability for creditors and fragility for debtors. Enforcement did not depend on circumstance, it depended on text. Courts enforced what was written, not what was possible.
In many societies, contracts allowed creditors to claim labor, restrict movement, or impose service until repayment was achieved. The agreement itself justified the outcome. Authority did not need to intervene beyond enforcement. This is where consent became central. By signing, the debtor accepted future outcomes they could not fully predict. The contract transformed uncertainty into obligation. What appeared voluntary at the moment of agreement became compulsory over time. And once enforcement relied on documentation, control no longer required supervision. Records replaced oversight, seals replaced judgment, procedure replaced discretion. The system worked because it reduced decision-making. Officials did not ask whether outcomes were just, they verified whether terms were met. This administrative clarity made debt systems resilient. They could scale across cities and generations without constant negotiation. But it also meant that escape became exceptional. Relief required intervention from rulers, not correction within the system. Mercy existed outside the contract, not within it. As a result, contracts did not merely record debt, they locked it. Once obligation was written, it followed the debtor regardless of circumstance. The agreement outlived intention, it outlasted capacity, it endured beyond consent. This is how paperwork replaced chains. Not by force, by permanence.
Debt systems did not collapse people through sudden failure, they did it through thresholds. In many ancient societies, missing a single payment did not immediately result in punishment. Instead, it triggered escalation. Terms changed, penalties activated, time limits narrowed. What mattered was not the size of the debt, but the moment it crossed a line. Once that line was crossed, options disappeared quickly. Ancient legal records show clear stages of enforcement. Initial delays led to fines. Fines led to extensions. Extensions led to substitution. When money could not be produced, labor replaced it. And labor rarely had an end date. What appeared as temporary service often became indefinite. Repayment schedules were reset, but conditions rarely improved. Each missed deadline pushed the debtor deeper into dependency. This is where debt stopped functioning as obligation and began functioning as confinement. A debtor bound to labor was no longer free to seek better conditions. Movement was restricted. Time was allocated. Decisions were no longer personal. What made this system effective was gradualism. There was no single moment of enslavement, no dramatic loss of freedom. Each step appeared reasonable in isolation. Each response followed established rules. By the time control was complete, it felt procedural. Families often attempted to absorb the burden. Children worked to reduce balances. Spouses substituted labor. Entire households became units of repayment. Debt expanded horizontally, not just vertically. The system did not ask whether repayment was realistic. It asked whether obligation had been acknowledged. Once acknowledged, enforcement followed. Missed payments were not treated as failure. They were treated as consent to escalation. This framing removed resistance. The debtor had already agreed to the consequences, even if those consequences were never fully understood. And because enforcement followed rules rather than decisions, no one appeared responsible for the outcome. Control was not imposed, it was activated. In this way, debt systems did not require cruelty to create permanence, they required patience. A missed payment did not end freedom immediately. It ended the possibility of reclaiming it. Debt systems did not collapse people through sudden failure, they did it through thresholds. In many ancient societies, missing a single payment did not immediately result in punishment. Instead, it triggered escalation. Terms changed, penalties activated, time limits narrowed. What mattered was not the size of the debt, but the moment it crossed a line. Once that line was crossed, options disappeared quickly. Ancient legal records show clear stages of enforcement. Initial delays led to fines. Fines led to extensions. Extensions led to substitution. When money could not be produced, labor replaced it. And labor rarely had an end date.
What appeared as temporary service often became indefinite. Repayment schedules were reset, but conditions rarely improved. Each missed deadline pushed the debtor deeper into dependency. This is where debt stopped functioning as obligation and began functioning as confinement. A debtor bound to labor was no longer free to seek better conditions. Movement was restricted. Time was allocated. Decisions were no longer personal. What made this system effective was gradualism. There was no single moment of enslavement, no dramatic loss of freedom. Each step appeared reasonable in isolation. Each response followed established rules. By the time control was complete, it felt procedural. Families often attempted to absorb the burden. Children worked to reduce balances. Spouses substituted labor. Entire households became units of repayment. Debt expanded horizontally, not just vertically. The system did not ask whether repayment was realistic. It asked whether obligation had been acknowledged. Once acknowledged, enforcement followed. Missed payments were not treated as failure. They were treated as consent to escalation. This framing removed resistance. The debtor had already agreed to the consequences, even if those consequences were never fully understood. And because enforcement followed rules rather than decisions, no one appeared responsible for the outcome. Control was not imposed, it was activated. In this way, debt systems did not require cruelty to create permanence, they required patience. A missed payment did not end freedom immediately, it ended the possibility of reclaiming it.
Debt systems did not stop at the individual. They expanded outward. In many ancient societies, obligation was not personal in the modern sense, it was collective. A debt incurred by one person could be absorbed by an entire household, and enforcement followed that logic. When repayment failed, families were drawn into the balance sheet. Children worked to reduce obligations they did not create. Spouses substituted labor to preserve property. Relatives entered service to prevent confiscation or punishment. Debt was redistributed across bloodlines. This expansion was not accidental. It stabilized the system. By spreading obligation, creditors reduced risk. Enforcement no longer depended on one body or one lifespan. If a debtor fell ill, aged, or died, responsibility did not vanish, it transferred. Legal frameworks supported this transfer explicitly. Records show children pledged as guarantees, households listed as units of obligation, and service assigned according to kinship rather than consent. This is where debt became generational. Once obligation could pass from parent to child, repayment ceased to be a goal. Continuity became the outcome. Families caught in this system were not enslaved all at once, they were gradually restricted. Education halted, mobility narrowed. Future choices were shaped by obligations signed years earlier. What made this system durable was normalization. Because families had always worked together, shared responsibility did not appear extraordinary. Debt simply redefined cooperation into enforcement. No single moment marked the loss of freedom. It unfolded through duty. And because family service was framed as honorable, resistance became difficult. To refuse meant risking collective punishment. To comply meant absorbing control quietly. The system rewarded compliance with survival, not release. This collective structure also protected authority. There was no single victim to point to. Obligation was diffuse, responsibility appeared shared. And once debt became a family condition, escape required more than repayment. It required separation from kin, property, and community. Few could afford that cost. By extending obligation across generations, debt systems ensured longevity. Control no longer needed to be renewed, it inherited itself. What began as a loan ended as lineage. This is how debt stopped being a burden and became a birth condition. Debt systems did not function in isolation. They required institutions to sustain them. Courts provided that structure.
In ancient societies, courts were not designed to evaluate fairness. They existed to verify obligation and enforce outcomes. Once a debt was recorded, the court's role was procedural, not moral. This distinction mattered. Judges did not ask whether repayment was realistic. They asked whether the contract existed. They did not consider circumstances. They confirmed compliance. Through this process, poverty became enforceable. When debtors appeared before courts, the outcome was often predetermined. If payment had failed, escalation followed automatically. Property was seized. Labor was assigned. Movement was restricted. The court did not create these outcomes, it legitimized them. Because enforcement followed established rules, decisions appeared neutral. Authority could claim it was not choosing sides, it was applying law. This removed accountability from individuals and placed it within process. Officials recorded outcomes without revisiting causes. A debtor's condition was not examined, only their obligation mattered. Once recognized, enforcement proceeded. This is how poverty became durable. Court records across Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome reveal patterns of repeat appearances. The same names, families, and households returned again and again, not because they resisted payment, but because the system recycled them. Debt did not disappear when enforced, it persisted in new forms. Labor assignments replaced monetary obligations, service replaced property, but the underlying condition remained unresolved. What made courts essential to this system was consistency. Predictable enforcement stabilized creditor confidence. Investors could lend knowing outcomes were guaranteed. Risk shifted away from capital and toward people. This encouraged expansion. As lending increased, so did enforcement. Courts processed obligation at scale. Debt ceased to be exceptional, it became administrative. And because the process appeared lawful, resistance carried legal consequences. To challenge enforcement meant challenging authority itself. Few could afford that risk. In this way, courts did not merely resolve disputes, they institutionalized inequality. Poverty was no longer a temporary condition, it was a status recognized by law. And once recognized, it could be managed, transferred, and enforced indefinitely.
Debt systems did not survive by accident. They were useful to power. Rulers quickly understood that widespread indebtedness created stability of a particular kind. A population bound by obligation was predictable, controllable, and less likely to resist authority. Permanent debt served governance. When large portions of society were tied to creditors, rulers gained leverage without direct force. Control could be outsourced to law, courts, and private enforcement, while the state maintained distance. This arrangement benefited elites on multiple levels. Tax collection became easier when households were already monitored through debt records. Labor could be mobilized indirectly. Public works drew from populations accustomed to obligation and service. Debt reduced the need for constant coercion. At the same time, rulers positioned themselves as arbiters rather than participants. They could intervene selectively through amnesties, cancellations, or reforms, gaining loyalty without dismantling the system itself. This created a cycle. Debt accumulated, tension increased, authority intervened, stability returned. The underlying structure remained unchanged. In many societies, rulers even profited directly. Fines, fees, and enforcement costs flowed upward. Confiscated property entered state hands. Debt disputes generated revenue through legal process. The system funded itself. What made this politically effective was plausibility. Rulers could claim they were preserving order, not enforcing exploitation. They did not create the debts. They merely upheld the law. Responsibility appeared distributed. This distancing insulated authority from backlash.
When unrest occurred, it was often framed as moral failure among debtors rather than structural design. Individuals were blamed, systems were preserved. Over time, debt became a tool of social classification. Those free of obligation held political influence. Those bound by debt did not. Participation required independence, and independence required exemption from the system. This ensured that power remained concentrated. Debt was not merely tolerated by rulers, it was integrated into governance. By allowing law to manage inequality, rulers reduced the visibility of force while maintaining its effect. Control did not need to be visible to be effective. It only needed to be normalized. And once normalized, debt stopped being a financial issue. It became a political one.
One of the most effective scams in ancient debt systems was consent. On paper, debt agreements were voluntary. Terms were acknowledged. Witnesses were present. Signatures or seals confirmed acceptance. Authority treated this as proof of choice. But choice existed only at the moment of signing. Consent in debt systems did not measure freedom, it measured necessity. People agreed to terms because alternatives had disappeared. Food shortages, taxes, illness, or social pressure narrowed options until obligation appeared preferable to collapse. The agreement was legal, the conditions were not equal. Once signed, consent became permanent. Courts did not revisit circumstances, they enforced outcomes. What mattered was that permission had been given at some point, regardless of how constrained that moment was. This is where the scam operated. Consent was used to legitimize consequences that no one would willingly choose with full information. Debtors accepted terms without understanding duration, escalation, or inheritance. They agreed to resolve short-term crises without seeing long-term control. The system relied on this gap. Agreements captured present desperation and extended it indefinitely. Authority treated the initial consent as binding across time, even as conditions changed beyond recognition. This removed responsibility from enforcement. If outcomes were severe, officials pointed to the agreement. The debtor had accepted the terms. The law had merely followed instruction. This framing transformed coercion into compliance. Debt systems did not need to force participation. They waited until pressure produced agreement, then recorded it as choice. Once consent was documented, resistance lost legitimacy. Attempts to escape were framed as breach, not survival. Challenges to enforcement became violations rather than appeals. This is why debt systems appeared orderly. They operated within rules. They respected procedure. But the procedure captured imbalance and froze it in writing. Consent did not protect the debtor. It protected the system. By treating agreement as timeless, debt law ignored the reality of changing circumstances. What began as a survival decision became a lifelong condition. And because everything followed legal process, the scam remained invisible. No lies were required, only signatures. For much of early history, slavery followed war. Captives were taken, ownership was clear, control was visible. Debt changed that. As debt systems matured, they began to produce labor more efficiently than conquest. No armies were required, no borders were crossed. Control emerged from within society itself. Debt slavery replaced war capture, not because it was kinder, but because it was cheaper and more stable. War was unpredictable. Captives had to be guarded. Resistance was constant. Supply was irregular. Debt systems solved all of these problems. They generated labor locally. They renewed themselves automatically. They required minimal enforcement. Most importantly, they carried legitimacy. A debtor bound by obligation was not seen as conquered. They were seen as responsible. Their condition appeared earned, not imposed. This distinction mattered. Societies that relied on debt bondage could expand labor pools without destabilizing political order.
There was no visible enemy, no external threat. Control blended into everyday life. Over time, debt-produced labor became preferable to prisoners of war. It was more predictable, it was administratively manageable, it aligned with legal frameworks already in place. Records show this transition clearly. As warfare declined or stabilized in certain regions, debt bondage increased. Labor needs were met not through raids, but through contracts and enforcement. This shift also changed perception. Captives could rebel openly, debtors could not. Resistance violated law, not authority. Escape became breach rather than defiance. Debt systems thus converted external violence into internal compliance. The outcome was similar. Freedom was lost, labor was extracted, control was maintained, but the method no longer relied on force. This made debt slavery harder to challenge. It lacked the moral clarity of conquest. There were no chains to point to, no battles to condemn. Only agreements, only records, only outcomes. By replacing war capture with debt, societies did not reduce exploitation, they refined it. Control became quieter, more durable, and far easier to defend.
As debt systems expanded, they stopped functioning as temporary solutions and began shaping social structure. Debt did not merely bind individuals, it organized society. Communities slowly divided along lines of obligation. Those free from debt gained autonomy, political voice, and mobility. Those bound by it lost all three. Status was no longer determined only by birth or skill, but by legal independence. This division stabilized hierarchy. A population accustomed to obligation was easier to manage. People bound by debt focused on survival rather than participation. They worked within limits defined by law and contract, not by ambition. Debt created predictability. Social mobility narrowed as obligations accumulated. Education, training, and opportunity became inaccessible to those whose time was already pledged. Future planning gave way to immediate compliance. Over generations, this pattern hardened. Debt ceased to be an event and became an expectation. Children inherited conditions they did not choose. Entire communities adapted to permanent constraint. What made this system resilient was normalization. Debt bondage blended into everyday life. It did not announce itself as oppression. It presented itself as order. Everyone knew their place. Everyone understood the rules. This apparent stability benefited elites and authorities. Disruption was rare. Resistance required resources debtors did not possess. And because the system operated through law rather than force, it avoided constant confrontation. Debt systems thus replaced overt domination with quiet alignment. People did not need to be watched constantly. Obligation regulated behavior internally. Fear of escalation maintained compliance without supervision. This internalization was critical. Once people accepted obligation as permanent, enforcement became almost unnecessary. The system governed itself. Social order no longer depended on punishment, it depended on expectation. Debt systems did not merely manage inequality, they structured it. By embedding obligation into daily life, societies ensured continuity without upheaval. And once hierarchy was justified as lawful outcome rather than imposed condition, challenging it became both risky and illegitimate. This is how debt became invisible architecture. Not seen, not questioned, but always present. Debt systems did not persist because laws were neutral. They persisted because laws were aligned. Across ancient civilizations, legal frameworks consistently favored creditors. This was not accidental. Credit was essential to trade, taxation, and state stability. Protecting it became a priority. The law reflected that priority.
Statutes detailed repayment terms, penalties, and enforcement mechanisms with precision. Protections for debtors were limited, conditional, or absent. Relief existed, but it was external to the system and discretionary. This imbalance shaped outcomes. When disputes arose, courts evaluated compliance, not capacity. Whether repayment was possible mattered less than whether obligation had been acknowledged. Once acknowledged, enforcement followed. This made debt predictable for lenders and dangerous for borrowers. Legal asymmetry reduced risk for those with capital. It encouraged lending by guaranteeing outcomes. Losses were absorbed by people, not by the system. Over time, this alignment reinforced itself. As more contracts were enforced, precedent accumulated. Judges relied on earlier rulings. Administrators standardized procedures. What began as policy became tradition. The system gained inertia. Citizens bound by debt did not lack legal standing, they lacked leverage. The law recognized their obligation but offered little space to renegotiate it. Appeals were rare, outcomes were fixed, flexibility was seen as threat to order. This rigidity protected creditors from uncertainty while transferring volatility to debtors' lives. The result was structural bias. Debt law did not ask who benefited, it asked what had been signed. And because signatures existed, enforcement proceeded. In this environment, citizenship lost meaning. Legal equality existed in theory, but collapsed under obligation. Rights depended on independence, and independence depended on exemption from debt. Those bound by contracts became administratively visible, but politically invisible. The law did not remove freedom directly, it priced it. Once priced, freedom became inaccessible to those already constrained. This is why debt systems endured reform. They were embedded into legal logic itself. To challenge them required rewriting law, not correcting behavior. Few societies were willing to do that.
When ancient societies tried to escape debt bondage, they did not attack slavery directly. They attacked the scam that sustained it. Debt cancellation was the most dangerous idea in debt-based systems. It did not question contracts, it erased them. And by doing so, it exposed how much control depended on obligation rather than productivity. Rulers understood this risk. Periodic debt amnesties appeared across civilizations, from Mesopotamian clean slates to later reforms in Greece and Rome. These acts were framed as mercy, restoration, or renewal, but their function was strategic. They prevented collapse. When too many people were bound by debt, economies stalled, labor withdrew, unrest increased, authority weakened. Cancellation was not compassion, it was maintenance. But amnesty came with limits. Debts were erased selectively, records were cleared temporarily, obligations reset, but structures remained. Interest returned, contracts reappeared, enforcement resumed. The system survived intact. This cycle revealed the scam's design. Debt cancellation was necessary because the system produced unsustainable outcomes, but it was dangerous because it proved that obligations were not inevitable, they were choices enforced by law. By granting relief only from above, rulers preserved authority. They positioned themselves as saviors without dismantling the mechanism that required saving. Reform became spectacle. Debtors celebrated release. Creditors absorbed losses temporarily. Order returned, and then accumulation resumed. This pattern repeated. Each cancellation confirmed that debt bondage was not natural. It required continuous enforcement, and each restoration proved that enforcement would return as soon as pressure eased. The scam was not that debt existed, it was that it pretended to be permanent while requiring constant intervention to survive. When people demanded cancellation, they were not rejecting obligation, they were rejecting inevitability. That is why reform movements were treated as threats.
Debt cancellation challenged legitimacy. It questioned whether law existed to serve order or to protect extraction. It forced societies to confront the difference. Most chose stability. They preserved the system and managed its excesses rather than dismantling it. And by doing so, they ensured that debt would remain a tool of control, interrupted only when it risked breaking itself.
Debt cancellation created relief, but it did not create change. Across ancient societies, amnesties were moments, not transformations. They erased obligations temporarily while leaving the underlying mechanisms untouched. This was not oversight, it was design. Amnesties addressed symptoms without altering structure. Records were cleared, but interest rules remained. Contracts were voided, but lending practices resumed. Enforcement paused, then restarted. The system learned to absorb disruption. Rulers granted relief to restore order, not to redistribute power. Once stability returned, creditors regained leverage. Lending resumed under similar terms. Accumulation began again. The cycle repeated. What prevented lasting reform was dependence. States relied on credit to function. Trade required loans. Taxes were advanced through obligation. Infrastructure depended on financing. Debt was woven into administration. Removing it entirely meant rethinking governance. Few societies attempted that. Instead, they treated debt as unavoidable and focused on managing its excesses. Amnesties became pressure valves. They released tension without dismantling the machine. This approach preserved continuity. Creditors accepted periodic loss in exchange for long-term dominance. Debtors accepted temporary relief, knowing it would not last. Authority accepted unrest as manageable. The system stabilized around repetition. What made this persistence possible was memory control. After each amnesty, records were reset, but narratives shifted. Debt returned framed as new obligation, not continuation. The past was erased administratively, even as patterns remained. This allowed society to believe in renewal while reproducing inequality. Over time, people learned that relief was conditional and temporary. Compliance became rational. Resistance became risky. The system did not need permanence to function. It needed inevitability. As long as debt always returned, amnesty lost its power to threaten structure. It became part of the rhythm rather than a rupture. This is why debt systems survived reform. They adapted without changing. And as long as obligation reappeared with familiar terms, control remained intact. Relief ended crises, but it never ended the system that caused them.
Debt systems did not rely on law alone. They required moral reinforcement. As obligation became permanent, societies developed narratives to explain why outcomes were justified. Debt was framed not as structural failure, but as personal responsibility. Owing money became a character flaw. Those bound by debt were described as careless, undisciplined, or irresponsible. Their condition was treated as evidence of failure rather than consequence of design. This moral framing mattered. It discouraged empathy. If debt was earned, relief appeared undeserved. If bondage resulted from poor choices, enforcement seemed fair. Law and morality aligned. Religious teachings, philosophical arguments, and social customs reinforced this alignment. Work was framed as virtue. Obedience became duty. Submission to obligation was presented as corrective rather than exploitative. These narratives stabilized the system. By blaming individuals, societies avoided examining structures. Debt bondage appeared as outcome, not mechanism. Responsibility shifted downward while control flowed upward. This moralization also reduced resistance. To challenge debt enforcement meant challenging social values, not just legal rules. Protest appeared selfish. Escape appeared dishonest. Compliance became synonymous with virtue.
The system did not need to silence dissent, it reframed it. Over time, moral judgment replaced coercion. People internalized obligation as identity. They accepted constraints as deserved. This internalization was more effective than force. When individuals believe they belong in their condition, enforcement becomes unnecessary. Shame regulates behavior more reliably than chains. Debt systems thus transformed exploitation into discipline. Those at the bottom were taught to accept outcomes. Those at the top were absolved of responsibility. The law enforced results, while morality explained them. This combination was powerful. Even when debt slavery was acknowledged as harsh, it was defended as necessary. Society could condemn cruelty while preserving structure. This moral buffer protected the system from collapse. As long as debt could be framed as deserved, control remained stable. And once morality defended law, slavery no longer needed to justify itself explicitly. It became the consequence of failing to live up to expectation. Debt bondage did not spread because civilizations copied one another. It spread because the logic worked. Across regions separated by distance, language, and culture, the same structures appeared. Similar laws, similar contracts, similar outcomes. Not through imitation, but through convergence. When societies faced scarcity, trade expansion, and state formation, debt offered a solution. It mobilized resources. It stabilized exchange. It reduced uncertainty for those with capital. And it transferred risk. Once introduced, the system evolved predictably. Interest accumulated. Enforcement hardened. Obligation extended beyond individuals. Control followed. These patterns emerged independently in Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, South Asia, and beyond. Different gods were invoked, different laws were written, but the mechanics aligned. Debt traps did not require conspiracy, they required incentives. Creditors sought security, states sought order, law provided structure. Together they produced systems that favored permanence over resolution. What made this spread efficient was universality. Any society with surplus, lending, and enforcement could reproduce the model. No central authority needed to coordinate it. The outcomes reinforced the inputs. Once debt systems proved reliable, alternatives appeared risky. Informal arrangements lacked enforceability. Collective solutions threatened hierarchy. Debt offered predictability. So it remained. Even when abuses were recognized, reforms targeted excess rather than structure. The core logic survived because it solved problems for those in power. This convergence explains persistence. Debt bondage did not spread like ideology. It spread like infrastructure, invisible, practical, and resistant to removal.
Debt slavery did not disappear. It transformed. As societies evolved, outright ownership of indebted bodies became harder to justify. Legal reforms narrowed definitions. Public discomfort grew. But the underlying need for controlled labor remained. The system adapted. Instead of binding people through lifelong obligation, economies began binding them through continuous dependence. Wages replaced bondage. Employment replaced ownership. But obligation remained embedded. The key change was visibility. Debt slavery was obvious. Wage dependence appeared voluntary. People worked by choice, not compulsion. Contracts could be exited. Movement seemed free. But the structure told a different story. Wages were calibrated to survival. Debt filled the gap between income and necessity. Loans replaced chains. Interest replaced enforcement. Time remained pledged. Freedom existed on paper. Dependence persisted in practice. This transition did not require moral rupture. It required reframing. Labor was no longer coerced by law, but compelled by necessity. Obligation shifted from explicit control to economic pressure.
The outcome was stability. Employers gained predictable labor without legal ownership. States gained mobile populations without visible bondage. Debt continued to regulate behavior without announcing itself. What made this evolution effective was continuity. Skills, habits, and expectations carried forward. People learned to live within constraint. Obligation became routine rather than exceptional. Debt no longer needed to threaten enslavement. It only needed to threaten exclusion. Missed payments led to loss of housing, access, or opportunity. Compliance maintained participation. Resistance carried social cost rather than legal punishment. This subtlety mattered. Systems that appear voluntary are harder to challenge. They distribute responsibility downward and hide enforcement within markets. Debt slavery ended formally. Debt dependence did not. The mechanism survived by reducing its visibility. Control no longer looked like ownership. It looked like employment. And because the transition preserved order without provoking resistance, it endured. Debt did not retreat from society. It changed language.
Debt systems did not survive because they were flawless. They survived because they were adaptable. Each time societies recognized harm, they adjusted the surface rather than the structure. Definitions were narrowed, terms were softened, language changed, but the core mechanics remained intact. This pattern repeated. Legal ownership became unacceptable, so contracts replaced it. Permanent bondage became controversial, so temporary dependence multiplied. Visibility decreased, enforcement moved into procedure. Reform focused on symptoms. Interest limits were adjusted, protections were introduced, exceptions were carved out. These changes reduced immediate harm while preserving long-term control. The system absorbed criticism without collapsing. What made reform difficult was integration. Debt had become embedded in trade, taxation, labor, and governance. Removing it entirely threatened economic coordination. Credit enabled growth. Obligation stabilized exchange. Enforcement maintained order. No alternative offered the same efficiency. As a result, reformers faced constraint. They could ease pressure without dismantling structure. Any deeper challenge risked instability. So reform became management. By refining rules rather than rethinking purpose, societies maintained continuity. People experienced improvement without gaining independence. The system appeared responsive without becoming accountable. This responsiveness preserved legitimacy. Each reform signaled progress, each adjustment implied learning, but the underlying relationship between obligation and control remained unchanged. Debt continued to discipline behavior. It limited risk-taking, it encouraged compliance, it filtered participation. The system did not need permanence to survive, it needed recurrence. As long as obligation returned after relief, control persisted. Reform became part of the cycle rather than an exit. This adaptability explains endurance. Debt systems did not resist reform, they incorporated it. By doing so, they preserved their role across eras, cultures, and economic models. What began as legal enslavement evolved into structural dependence without losing function. The system changed form, not purpose.
Debt did not dominate societies because it was hidden. It dominated because it was legal. Once control could be exercised through contracts, courts, and records, force became unnecessary. Authority no longer needed to threaten, it only needed to administer. This was the final transformation. Slavery had required visibility. Chains, ownership, and punishment made control obvious. Debt replaced those signals with paperwork, deadlines, and procedure. Nothing appeared imposed, everything appeared agreed upon. Legality dissolved resistance by reframing it. To challenge outcomes was to challenge law itself. Escape became breach, protest became disorder. This framing insulated power. When outcomes were harmful, responsibility dispersed.
Creditors pointed to contracts, officials pointed to rules, rulers pointed to stability. No single actor appeared accountable. The system governed without revealing its governors. What made this structure durable was normalization. Children grew up within obligation. Adults planned lives around repayment. Institutions assumed dependence as baseline. Control blended into routine. Over time, debt stopped being questioned. It became environment. This is why debt systems outlived moral criticism, political reform, and legal change. They adopted language, softened appearance, and reduced visibility without altering function. Control remained. What began as a legal justification for slavery became a framework for managing populations, not through ownership, but through obligation, not through violence, but through consent shaped by necessity. This is not a story about ancient cruelty. It is a case study in how systems persist when they no longer look like what they are. Debt did not disappear when slavery ended. It learned to hide. And once legality made control invisible, it no longer needed to defend itself.